It's 7:33. This is Pacific Mornings. Now, the Prime Minister and Labour leader are trading blows after a surprise law change making it harder for workers to prove gender-based pay discrimination. Now, the change is expected to save the government billions in potential wage increases. Labour calls it a pay cut, a claim National's Chris Bishop slams as an outright lie. Prime Minister Christopher Luxon joins me now to discuss this. Good morning, welcome back.
Good morning, William. Good to be with you.
Look, can you put this simply for us? I mean, there's been a lot of speculation. What does this actually mean?
Yeah, look, I want to be really clear that we're not changing what's called equal pay. We're not changing what's called pay parity. We're not changing what's called collective bargaining, where unions and individuals can negotiate with their employers. What we're doing is we're fixing up a law that's become quite unworkable and also quite unaffordable, and that's called pay equity. And that's essentially where you look at you think about sectors that are largely worked in by women, and then they compare the work that they do, and they say it's of equal value to work that maybe men are doing or other workers in another sector. And that's a really good thing. Like, it's a really good thing because it gets rid of sex-based discrimination in sectors, and particularly for sectors where what has been traditionally called, they'd call it in the old days, they used to call it women's work, or what the legislation used to call women's work. So all we're doing is we're not getting rid of what that's called pay equity, and we're not getting rid of that. But what we are doing is saying, hey, listen, a lot of this was quite unworkable. We ended up having, for example, librarians being compared to fisheries officers. We had administration workers being compared to civil engineers. And sort of the list goes on. So we've got to get clear about the comparators when we look at the sectors. We also had a situation where the claims were very, very broad. So you'd have up to 90 different jobs, and with multi-employers all coming together as one group to say, look, we think our pay needs to be the same as someone else in a different sector or a different job in a different sector. And yet those jobs were completely different and of different value, essentially. So all we're doing is just giving clarity and certainty and making sure it's fixable, it's workable, and sustainable going forward. And so that the reason there's a lot of misinformation going around, and if you were on the internet, you'd be seeing all sorts of things, that we're cutting women's pay, that equal pay is gone. There's no change. We're just changing a piece of it called pay equity, and it's to make sure that it's a fairer, clearer system that gives people much more certainty going forward. So the government has put a lot of money aside because we sadly do expect to continue to meet pay equity settlements, because we think there are industries and sectors where there are low paid workers that are largely female dominated sectors that actually should be paid more than what they actually are.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And yep, I totally get that you're saying that's not a pay cut, right, to point that out. But
Yeah.
inevitably, though, this is, put simply, making it harder, right?
It's just making it clearer, like it's being clear to say, look, is there evidence of long-term underpayment because this is an industry dominated by women? We just want to be clear about that. We want to make sure the comparators are relevant to the sector, that they're actually, otherwise it loses credibility and everybody goes, well, this isn't making any sense. The other piece is just making sure that actually the claims are very specific, not broad. You're not capturing those 90 people in 90 different jobs and calling that one claim when those 90 jobs are very different from each other. So it's just being really specific about that. Now, the government expects, as I said, to pay, we still support, we're very, very committed to pay equity because it's a really good thing. In fact, National introduced it in 2017 off the back of the Terra Nova case. And all we're doing is going back to essentially the principles of that legislation to make sure that it's fair and clear for everybody.
Look, how will Pacific women who already fare terribly when it comes to pay gaps be protected under these changes?
Well, the first thing to say is that equal pay remains, collective bargaining remains. So there are, we want all New Zealanders to get a pay rise, right? We'd love every New Zealander to get a pay increase. The way to do that is we've got to grow the economy, obviously. But all the things and the protections that have existed are still there. So if you're part of a union or an individual, you can negotiate with your employer every 2 or 3 years when your union contract comes up. You can actually do what's called collective bargaining. Equal pay is a concept that men and women get paid the same for doing the same work. And pay equity, the thing we're just talking about, still remains. And so sectors will lodge claims pay equity claims under the new law, and we're expecting quite a few of them to do so. Because
Yeah.
yeah, and then we will make settlements to make sure that we lift those pays in those sectors where there has been long-term, sex-based discrimination.
Yeah, I just want to. Yesterday, I spoke with the winner of your own Prime Minister's Science Teacher Award, Dr. Aidan Kiley. He said frontline staff and Pacific women are being deprioritised and it was affecting the quality of education. He also told me it was hard to accept the award from you while the government was cutting pay equity. What's your response to that?
Well, again, I'm not sure that, with all respect, I mean, I was really impressed. He's an amazing teacher. He's done an incredible job. I was really proud to give him the Prime Minister's Science Award because I thought it was really important. But I just say to you, there's nothing to stop any of the sectors from applying for pay equity if there's a pay equity claim. We're just getting it clearer and we're just bringing, what happened was we had a court case, which was which was Christine Bartlett's case, if you remember, for care workers, and where she took her employer to court. She won that case, and rather than having things go to court, New Zealand got very progressive under a national government. We said, let's do this as a law to make sure not everyone has to go to court and incur all that time and hassle and stuff like that. Let's do it as a law. Very
Mm.
few, not every other country does it that way. We then had a law. Labor came in, took 3 years, mucked around with it, did it under urgency, made a whole bunch of mistakes in drafting the law, and lo and behold, you've ended up with something quite unworkable and unaffordable. So I appreciate there's a lot of emotion around it, but I just ask that people really just look at the facts of what we're doing. And all we're doing is making it so that the system going forward is workable. But most importantly, there will be pay equity claims. We encourage people to apply for a pay equity claim. We want to fix long-term sex-based discrimination. But let's get clear on the facts because there's a lot of misinformation and there's a lot of, I think, deliberate scaremongering going on as to what it is and what it isn't.
Yeah, certainly. Look, let's quickly talk budget, my favourite time of year. I love budget day. Nicola Willis says this will
Probably
not be
one
a
of the
lolly.
few people who love budget day and all the intricacies of it. That's great.
I love Budget Day. I love OCR Day. I love all of it, Prime Minister. Anyway, Nicola Willis says this will not be a lolly scramble. Fair enough, some would argue, given the climate we're in. But should we expect any targeted support towards Pacific communities in this upcoming budget?
Well, actually, let's be clear, we've been through a very difficult time given the mess that the last government, the Labor government, created and caused. We're fixing that up. You're seeing interest rates come down, inflation come down, the economy's starting to grow. So we've turned the corner. There's a lot more for us to push on and do. Now we've got a chance to actually shape and grow New Zealand in the way that we want to. So we realize all of its potential. So the budget will actually be what we call the growth budget. So we're making significant investments in health and education, in transport and infrastructure, and also in economic growth. Economic growth is so important because actually that's how you lift people up Pacifica or non-Pacifica, across the whole of the country, by getting them into the economy that's actually growing where there's opportunity for everybody.
Mm. Just final question for you. And I've been pondering it ever since Nicola Willis said this wouldn't be a lolly scramble. Is it fiscal prudence or is it austerity? And dare I ask, are we going to see something like Ruth Richardson's budget?
No, you're going to see a budget that's we call the growth budget because we want to make sure we are making investments and we're spending significant amounts of money. If you just think about healthcare and think about the amount of money that we've put into healthcare, it's a record amount. No government in the history of New Zealand has added another $17 billion last budget. There'll be more money for health this budget. There'll be more money for education this budget. There was, I think, $3 billion last year. That all helps the Pacific community. We want to make sure they get their kids to school like everyone across this country. We want to be able to teach them to read and be able to do maths. We're putting big investment into that. Why? Because if they can learn everyone can learn, our kids can learn to do maths and reading, that sets them up for high paying jobs, ultimately higher paying jobs with better education. So no, you're going to see investment here. And, but, we're also got to be responsible because, this is a country that's living well above its means.
Mm.
Essentially every Thursday, the government goes out and borrows $500 million every Thursday, essentially. That's a lot of money. And we've got to find a pathway for the long term to get New Zealand, manage its debt down over time, but do it in a sensible, responsible way. And that's what we're doing.
It seems like this government just makes unpopular decision after unpopular decision. You cop the hate in the media and from the public as well. Do you ever just sit back sometimes and think, oh, jeepers, is it actually all worth it? Should we just give them the lolly scramble?
Well, it's just not good for New Zealand, right? I mean, just take this number in, William, which is quite interesting. The debt has gone from $60 billion to $180 billion. Essentially, that is a huge increase in debt. We used to pay $3 billion on interest on our debt. Today we pay 11, what will be 9, 10, $11 billion ultimately. That is $11 billion that we spend. That would be as much as what we spend on police, justice, corrections, the defence force, and customs combined. That's a lot of schools, hospitals, support that we could give people. And the reason we've got that debt is because the last government didn't manage it. They just taxed more, spent more, borrowed more. And you can carry on doing that, in your own personal finances. All your listeners listening here say, I can go out and max out the credit cards. I can go max out my bank loans. I can go to some shady operators and get some predatory, really expensive loans. I feel good in the moment because I get the sugar hit of buying what I want to buy, but I can't afford it. And as a result, the piper comes at some point and you've got to pay it. And New Zealand's debt is the highest it's been since 1990. And so I would love to be the easiest thing as a politician to say, look, I'll just push that down to the next generation of prime ministers and governments. But I've got a responsibility to our kids and to our grandkids to load them up with so much debt that they don't have choices in the future. And New Zealand has less opportunity. And I want New Zealand to have great opportunity. So we've got to be responsible with the finances. That doesn't mean that we continue to make big investments, but you're making, it's a bit like when you borrow money from the bank for your house. That's a good amount of debt, right? But in the case of New Zealand, what the Labour government did is they borrowed money just on the credit card for basically the consumable stuff that you're buying every day, right? And that's not good.
Yeah, totally. Speaking of the last government, I've got the opposition leader waiting in the wings next. Thank you very much for your time.
Give him my regards. Hi, Chris.
I will do. We just had Prime Minister Christopher Luxon, and now we're joined by the opposition leader, Chris Hipkins. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Look, we spoke with the Prime Minister first, of course, of the pay equity fiasco. I mean, it's become a blame game. He's blaming you guys. What do you make of the whole situation?
Well, look, if the Prime Minister is blaming us for wanting women to be fairly paid, then, look, I'll take that on the chin. I think we are committed to making sure that women are fairly paid and that there isn't ongoing gender-based discrimination against women in New Zealand when it comes to their pay. The fact that women still earn less than men for work of the same value in this day and age is totally unacceptable. We were working to fix that. The current government have come in and in one fell swoop, they've cancelled all 33 active pay equity claims and said to those largely women workforces, sorry, start all over again. I just think that's wrong. That shouldn't be the way they balance their budget.
With that in mind, I mean, look, to the point that Luxon's trying to make, in terms of the parameters being too loose around it, can you concede that it was?
No, not at all. Because ultimately, the challenge that you've got here is that you do need to compare workforces that might not, on the surface of it, look directly comparable. Because for many of the workforces, many of the professions dominated by women, there aren't direct comparisons of a same workforce that's dominated by men. And that's exactly the problem. So what you have to do is ask the question of what is work of equal value, even if the work is different. And so there is a very detailed process around how you choose comparators to determine whether or not there's sex-based undervaluation going on in a workforce. It's not just a question of saying, oh, that job looks like it's equivalent, let's just whack those two jobs together and come up with a number. It's much more complicated and sophisticated than that. So the comparator workforces are actually negotiated between the government, the employer, and the employee. So if the government didn't like the workforces that are being compared with one another, they could negotiate to change them. They chose not to do that. Instead, they chose to extinguish the 33 active claims. Why did they do that? Because, as David Seymour himself publicly said, they wanted to save billions of dollars.
Look, let's put it simply, perhaps particularly for our Pacific women, they are paid poorly in comparison to, say, Pākehā men, and also there is that, ethnicity factor as well. Will this not lead to worse outcomes from a pay equity perspective?
Undoubtedly, this sends a very clear message from the government to those very women. Sorry, you're going to have to wait longer. And when you do finally get a pay equity claim settled, you're not going to get as much money because we've decided that balancing the government's budget is more important than paying women properly. That's the very clear message that Nicola Willis, Christopher Luxon, David Seymour, and Brooke Van Velden have sent women all over the country.
Let's turn our attention to the budget. Listen to your pre-budget speech yesterday. It was very good, nuanced in the sense of, though, let's talk about the comments that Nicola Willis made. It's been well publicised now that this will not be a lolly scramble budget. Again, a lot of the blow goes back to the previous government and its spending. Do you acknowledge that the spending under your government and at the Ardern government was just too rampant?
I saw a thing on TV1, I think a week or so back, where every single Minister of Finance had said, this is not a lolly scramble budget. That's what every Minister of Finance says about their budget. Nicola Willis is treading a very well-worn path there. Ultimately, the big challenges that the country faces are not being addressed by Nicola Willis in this budget. If you look at why government spending's been increasing, it's things like an ageing population. It's things like the fact that we as a government, we're paying people better. I'm not going to apologise for increasing nurses' pay, increasing teachers' pay, increasing the pay of the lowest paid workers in the country. And yet Nicola Willis bangs on about how this was wasteful spending and a lolly scramble, actually helping people to pay their bills and making sure that they're properly rewarded for the work that they are doing isn't wasteful spending.
Certainly. Look, I mean, again, and I come back to the point of, to the point of Nicola Willis, is she not just pursuing fiscal prudence, or is this austerity?
This is absolutely austerity. It's been shown to fail elsewhere. This is the government saying we're more interested in balancing our budget than balancing the country's overall economic ledger. And they are quite happy for the lowest paid New Zealanders to bear the brunt of that. So minimum wage workers, for example, have had a minimum wage increases 2 years in a row that are less than the rate of inflation. What that means in real terms, their pay is actually going backwards. Minimum wage workers are earning less relative to their expenses than they were 2 years ago. I don't think as you're going through a cost of living crisis, that's a morally justifiable thing for government to do.
I don't know if this is a question for you, but keen to get your perspective as I think it's important. Apparently unions have been barred from the lockup for budgets next week. What do you make of that? And is it important for government to have a working relationship with unions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just wrong. We invited the business groups in. They didn't always like what we had to say around the budget. I think the debate around the budget should be an informed debate. And simply cutting people out of the budget lockup means that when they're asked to comment on the budget, they're not going to be able to deliver as informed a comment as if they were in the budget lockup. Surely the government want them to be able to comment in an informed way on the budget. Maybe they don't, because maybe they can then try and discredit the unions by saying, oh, well, they don't know what they're talking about. I just think it's silly, it's short-sighted, it's petty. They should let them in.
Does Labor actually have a track record to stand on when it comes to fiscal prudence?
Well, if you go back and you look at, how let's take surpluses, government surpluses, which Nicola Willis seems to think are the be-all and end-all. In the last 25 years, Labor's delivered roughly 2 to 3 times the number of government surpluses as national governments have. I'm not going to have national bang on there about fiscal responsibility when they borrowed as much money during the global financial crisis as we borrowed during COVID-19. When you get an economic shock as a country, you need to support the country through that. We didn't do anything that was more or less than what the national government did in the global financial crisis. And we were dealing with COVID. Probably the one thing that we did that they didn't do was the wage subsidy for people when we were experiencing lockdowns as a result of COVID. Of course, they didn't do that because they didn't need to do that. But actually, at the time, the National Party was saying we needed to be more generous with the wage subsidy. So they're now rewriting history and trying to say that it was the wrong thing to do.
Well, final question for you, and perhaps it's a cheeky one to ask, but where does the misconception come from then? If, Kiwis, at least who I talk to, there is this idea that perhaps Labor is a bit too trigger happy when it comes to spending that card compared to, say, National.
I think people just make an assumption that because the National Party is full of business people, that they're somehow going to be better at managing the country's finances than Labor people are. But let's put some facts on the table. Wages grew faster under Labor. The economy grew faster under Labor. The number of jobs in the economy grew faster under Labor. And the number of people unemployed was lower under Labor.